The Thousand Hands had never lost a world, and on the morning the small gray ship arrived, no one aboard the Crown of Worlds thought it would be the first. Conscript Yato Ren stood at the lowest scan rail of the flagship and counted the human vessel 3 times, because his training said a number repeated 3 times could not be a mistake. One ship, 410 meters from blunt nose to squared stern, a hull the color of wet stone, with no banners, no kill marks, no shrine to any god of war. It carried fewer guns than a Voltrine supply barge. It hung at the edge of the captured system of Hesh like a piece of debris that had drifted in and forgotten to leave. Yato was 19 seasons old. He had been pressed into the ascendancy 2 years before, taken from a quiet ledger house on a world the Thousand Hands had folded into the Empire without firing a shot, because that was how the Voltrine took worlds. They did not always burn. They arrived in such numbers that resistance became a kind of madness, a thing only the unwise attempted, and the wise simply opened their gates and learned the new anthem. Yato had learned the anthem. He had learned to stand at the scan rail and report what he saw and feel nothing about it. He did not feel nothing now. He felt the cold thing that lived under his ribs wake up and stretch. "Provost," he said into the rail line. "Single contact, unflagged. It is just sitting there." The answer came back bored. Provost General Sol Varek had folded 40 worlds in his long career and had stopped being surprised by anything a smaller people might try. "Then, it is a coward or a corpse. Mark it and forget it. We make planetfall on Hesh in 9 hours." Yato marked it. He did not forget it. He had learned the anthem, but he had not learned how to stop being from a small people, and a small people knows the look of a thing that is waiting on purpose. The Thousand Hands filled the sky around Hesh. That was not a figure of speech aboard the Crown of Worlds. The armada was 1,100 ships, and they did not fly in the thin, scattered lines of other navies. The Voltrine flew in a wall, hull beside hull beside hull, a sheet of metal so wide that from the surface of a doomed world, it looked like the sky had grown a ceiling. That was the whole doctrine of the ascendancy. You did not outthink the people you conquered. You did not outshoot them. You simply came in such mass that the idea of fighting back died in their throats before any weapon could be raised. The Thousand Hands had taken 1,406 worlds this way. Not one had been lost. The thing the conquered always learned, sooner or later, was that the Voltrine were not great warriors. They were great arrivers. Every soldier in the armada knew, in the part of the mind that is never spoken aloud, that the Empire had never once been tested by an enemy who refused to be impressed by numbers. Yato Ren knew it. He kept it under his ribs with the cold thing. He had learned a great deal at the scan rail, more than the Voltrine knew he had learned, because a conscript who watches and says little becomes invisible, and an invisible thing sees everything. He had learned that the Thousand Hands carried no medics worth the name, because an armada that never bled did not think it needed them. He had learned that the war anthem was sung 3 times a day, and that the singing was loudest aboard the ships with the most folded crew, as if volume could replace belief. He had learned that the officers of the Voltrine had never, in the whole of their training, studied a single battle the Empire had lost, because there were none, and that a people who has never studied losing does not know the shape of it when it comes, the way a person who has never been cold does not know to fear the first chill. Most of all, he had learned the doctrine of the wall, which the Voltrine called the only true thing in the universe. The wall was not a formation. It was a belief made of metal. 1,100 hulls flown so close that they became a single fact, and the fact said, "We are too many to refuse." A people on the ground looked up, saw the sky grow a ceiling, and the war died in their throats. That was the genius of the Thousand Hands, and Yato had come to understand that it was also the whole of its weakness, because a wall is only a wall while everyone agrees to believe it is one. The Voltrine had never met anyone who simply declined to believe. The gray ship at the edge of the system did not appear to believe. The human ship did not move for 6 hours. Then, with planetfall 3 hours away and the first landing barges already warming in the Crown's belly, it spoke. It did not threaten. That was the first wrong note. Every people the Thousand Hands had ever met had threatened first, because a threat is what a frightened thing does to feel larger. The human ship sent a single plain message, in clean trade speech, on a channel everyone in the Armada could hear. This is the warship Even Keel, out of Earth. You are anchored over a world that asked us to come. Stand down your landing, and you may leave the way you arrived. Begin your descent, and you will not. Provost General Varek laughed. Yato heard it carry down the rail line, a wet, pleased sound. Even Keel, the provost said, tasting the words. They named their one ship after a thing a boat does. Not after a flame, not after a beast, after balance. He said it the way a man says the name of a meal he is about to eat. Open the channel. I will answer the balance boat myself. He answered it grandly. He listed the worlds the Thousand Hands had folded. He listed the navies that had tried to stand and now sang the Voltrine anthem in their schools. He told the Even Keel that one ship against 1100 was not a battle, it was a mathematics, and the mathematics was already decided. He gave the human captain the mercy of a single chance to flee. The human captain's name, when the answer came, was Idun Mercer, and her voice did not rise or fall. I have read your record, Provost. 1406 worlds. I am not here to argue your mathematics. I am here to change the question. A pause. The length of one breath. You count ships. You have never had to count what holds them in place. Then the Even Keel went quiet, and the descent began anyway, because Varek would not be lectured by a balance boat, and the Thousand Hands had never once been stopped. Yato Ren watched the first wave of landing barges drop from the wall of the Armada. Hundreds of them, fat and slow, packed with occupation troops and anthem singers and the long gray machines that printed Voltrine law onto a conquered street. He watched them fall toward Hesh, a brown and blue world that had begged a far-off species for help and received, apparently, a single 400-meter ship named after balance. He felt sorry for Hesh. He had felt sorry for a great many worlds. Feeling sorry was the only piece of his old self the anthem had not yet taken. The barges were 11 minutes into descent when the Even Keel moved. It did not charge the Armada. It did not fire. It turned its blunt nose down toward the planet, toward the falling barges, and from its squared stern, something opened that Yato had no word for. Not a gun port, not an engine, a wide dark throat that drank the light around it, so that the stars behind the human ship smeared and bent, as if space itself were being gathered and wound onto a spool. Scan, Varek snapped, and the bored sound was gone from his voice. What is that? What is it doing? Yato's instruments did not know. They had readings for weapons and shields and engines and 1,000 kinds of trick. They had no reading for what the Even Keel was doing, because the Even Keel was not doing any of those things. It was reaching out, gently, with a field no Voltrine sensor had a name for, and it was taking hold of the falling barges the way a careful hand takes hold of a fly without crushing its wings. The barges stopped. 240 of them, mid-descent, halted in the air over Hesh, not destroyed, not even scratched, simply stopped, hung in the high cold sky, engines screaming at full burn against nothing, going nowhere. The Even Keel held them the way a man holds a door he has decided will not open. A long silence moved through the Thousand Hands. 1,100 ships, and Yato could feel every one of them go still, the way a crowd goes still, when something happens that the crowd has no song for. He looked at the readings again. The held barges showed full power, full life signs, full structural integrity. Nothing aboard them had been touched. They simply could not fall. He had spent 2 years watching the Thousand Hands break the will of worlds by dropping that exact rain of barges out of the sky, the slow brown rain of occupation that no people had ever stopped, and he had watched it stop in 11 seconds. 240 barges hung in the high air like beads on a thread that no one could see. The people of Hesh, far below, would be looking up at a thing no conquered people had ever seen. The rain had stopped falling. Someone had caught it. Yato wondered what that did to a people who had given up. He thought he knew. He had given up once, on a quiet world with a ledger house, and he knew exactly what it would have done to him to look up and see the rain caught in the sky. Varek found his voice. Cut them loose. Whatever it is doing, burn through it. Send the second wave to break the field. The second wave dropped, 300 more barges, and behind them, for the first time in the campaign, true warships peeling off the wall to kill the gray ship that had dared to put a hand on the hands. The even keel held the second wave too, and the third, it did not strain, it did not glow brighter or shudder, it simply opened its throat a little wider and took hold of more, and the falling stopped, and the screaming engines burned themselves toward empty against a stillness that did not care. Yato Ren stood at the scan rail with the cold thing fully awake under his ribs now, and he understood, before any officer aboard the Crown of Worlds was willing to say it, what the human captain had meant. You count ships. You have never had to count what holds them in place. The Voltrine had built an empire on one idea, that mass cannot be argued with, that enough hulls in one sky is a fact the universe must accept, and a single gray ship named after balance had just looked at all 1,100 of those hulls and decided, quietly, that they would stay exactly where they were. The mathematics had not been decided after all. It had only been waiting for someone to count the other side. For the first hour, Provost General Varek refused to call it a defeat, because a defeat was a thing that had never happened, and a man cannot name what he has never seen. He called it an obstruction. He called it a trick of fields and mirrors. He sent his gunmasters every order in the Voltrine book, and the Voltrine book was 9,000 years deep. They fired sustained beams into the dark throat of the even keel, and the beams went in and did not come out. They launched flights of seeker missiles, and the missiles slowed in the air 100 meters from the human hull and hung there, twitching like insects in honey. They ordered the held barges to overburn their engines until the engines failed, on the theory that a dead barge would at least fall, and the barges did not fall. The even keel held the dead ones as gently as the live ones. It did not seem to know the difference, or care. Yato Ren reported all of it from the scan rail in a voice he kept flat, because a flat voice was the only protection a conscript had. Inside, he was doing a thing he had not done since the day the 1,000 hands folded his homeworld. He was watching a wall of certainty crack, and he was being careful not to smile. The cracking did not look like much from the outside. That was the strange part. There was no fire on the human hull, no answering barrage, no great display for the held armada to fear. The even keel simply hung there and absorbed everything the 1,000 hands could throw, the way deep water absorbs a stone, with a small ripple and then nothing. Yato had expected a weapon to look like a weapon. He had not expected the most powerful thing he had ever seen to look like patience. He thought about the surface of Hesh while the gunmasters spent the Empire's fury on a ship that drank it. He had access to the long-range feed, and he kept it open in a corner of his station, where no officer would notice, and he watched the world the Voltrine had come to fold. The cities of Hesh had gone dark at the first sight of the Armada, the way every conquered world went dark, every light extinguished, every street emptied, a planet holding its breath and praying the rain of barges would fall somewhere else. That was what the wall did to people before a single soldier ever touched the ground. It made them put themselves out like candles. But the rain had stopped in the sky, and on the feed, Yato watched the cities of Hesh begin, very slowly, to relight. One window, then a street, then a whole district. A people who had blown out its own lights was striking them again, one by one, looking up at 240 barges frozen in the high air, and deciding, against everything the 1,000 hands had taught the galaxy, that the dark was no longer required. Yato kept the feed open and kept his face flat and did not smile, and under his ribs the cold thing turned over and over. "Provost," said the senior gunmaster, an old Voltrine named Echo Drain, whose chest was heavy with the kill marks of 40 foldings. "We have put more fire into that ship in 1 hour than it took to fold the Resh coalition entire. There is no scratch, there is no strain in the field. I do not believe the ship is defending itself. I believe it is ignoring us." "Ships do not ignore the 1,000 hands," Varek said. "This one is," Drain said, and to his credit he said it plainly, the way a soldier must when the truth has become more dangerous than the silence. "Provost, I have read the human captain's words again. She did not say she would fight us. She said she would not let us leave. We have been trying to break a wall she put in front of the planet. She did not put it in front of the planet. He let that sit. She put it in front of us." Varek did not answer for a long moment. Yato, at the rail, ran his own scan again, and the cold thing under his ribs turned over, because the old gunmaster was right, and Yato had seen it 3 minutes before any officer, and had said nothing, because a conscript, who sees too clearly, does not live to see more. The even keel was not blockading Hesh. It had stopped the landing, yes, but the wide field from its throat was no longer pointed at the world. Sometime in the last hour, while the armada poured fire into a ship that drank it, the human vessel had quietly turned the field outward, and it had begun, hull by hull, to take hold of the thousand hands. Not violently. A Voltrine warship would be flying its patrol arc along the wall of the armada, and then it would simply stop responding to its own helm. Its engines still burned, its crew still lived, but the ship would no longer go where it was steered. It hung in the wall, fixed, a tooth that would not come out of the jaw, while around it the other ships flew on and slowly, one by one, joined it in stillness. By the second hour, 60 ships of the thousand hands could not move. By the third, it was 400. "It is anchoring us," Drain said, and now even his old voice had gone thin. "That is what the name means. That is what a keel is. Not a weapon, a thing that holds a vessel steady so the sea cannot turn it. The humans did not send a warship to outshoot the largest armada in the arm of the galaxy. They sent a tug." He laughed, and there was no joy in it, only the terrible clean wonder of a man watching his whole life's craft become useless in an afternoon. "They sent a single tug, and it is parking us." Yato Ren learned 3 things in that third hour, and he kept all of them under his ribs. The first was that the even keel had a partner it had never needed to name. Far below, on the surface of Hesh, the begging world was no longer simply waiting to be folded. The people of Hesh had watched the sky stop falling, had watched 240 barges hang frozen over their cities, and they had begun, quietly, to come out of their shelters. They were not fighting. They had no means to fight the thousand hands. But a conquered people who sees the sky held in place by someone on their side does a thing more dangerous than fighting. It stops believing the lie that resistance is madness. Yato, who came from a small people that had swallowed that lie whole, watched the long-range feed of Hesh and felt something he had not felt in 2 years. He felt the lie loosen. The second thing he learned was the size of the field. He had assumed, at first, that the even keel could only hold what it could see, a cone in front of its dark throat. But the held ships were not all in front of it. They were scattered through the wall of the armada, port and stern, above and below, as if the human ship were reaching with 100 invisible arms in every direction at once. There was no edge to it that Yato's instruments could find. The even keel did not aim. It simply decided which ships would stay, and they stayed. The third thing he learned was the worst, and he learned it by accident. He ran a power trace on the human hull, hoping to find the engine that fed the field, hoping to find a number large enough to explain it, because a large number is a thing a Voltrine mind can fight. He did not find a large number. He found a small one. The even keel was spending almost no power at all. Whatever the dark throat did, it did not push against the armada. It did not strain to hold 1,100 ships. Holding them cost it nearly nothing, the way it costs a stone nearly nothing to sit at the bottom of a river while the whole river fails to move it. Yato understood then that the humans had not built a more powerful engine. They had found a different question, the one Captain Mercer had named in her first answer. The Voltrine had spent 9,000 years making mass into a weapon, and the humans had simply asked what holds mass in place, and built the answer into a 400-meter hull, and sent it alone to a world that had asked for help. He did not report the small number. He told the provost the field was beyond his instruments. It was the first lie Yato Ren had told the Thousand Hands, and it tasted like clean water. He understood, holding that small number under his ribs, why it was the most dangerous fact aboard the Crown of Worlds. The whole authority of the Thousand Hands rested on the idea that strength was a quantity. More hulls, more guns, more mass, and the more was always available, because the empire was large and the conquered were small, and largeness fed largeness. A Voltrine commander, faced with any obstacle, did one thing: he brought more. It was the only verb the empire truly knew, and the small number meant that more would not work. The even keel was not winning by being larger, it was winning by being correct. You cannot outmass a thing that costs nothing to do what it does. You cannot bury a stone deeper into the riverbed. The Voltrine had built 9,000 years of war on a verb that had just stopped functioning, and they did not yet know it, and Yato did, and he said nothing, because the longer they reached for more, the more completely the lesson would land. He watched the gunmasters call for more. More beams, more seekers, more warships peeling off the wall. He watched every one of them fail, in exactly the same way, gently, without drama, the human ship taking hold of each new thing and setting it still. And he watched the first flicker of a thing he had never seen on a Voltrine face cross the bridge of the Crown of Worlds, the thing that comes to a person when the only tool he has ever owned turns to water in his hand. It was not fear, yet. It was confusion, which is the doorway fear walks through. In the fourth hour, Varek tried the thing every cornered commander tries. He tried to leave. The Voltrine had never retreated. There was no word for it in the war anthem. But there was a word for repositioning, and the Provost General used it, and he ordered the unheld portion of the Thousand Hands, still some 600 ships, to break formation and pull back from Hesh, to regroup beyond the reach of whatever the gray ship was. The 600 ships fired their engines. The 600 ships did not move. Not one of them. The order to retreat had been given in the clear, on the Armada's command channel, and the even keel had heard it, and the human ship had answered by closing its hand. The whole Armada stopped at once. 1,100 hulls, fixed in the sky over Hesh, engines howling, going nowhere, the wall of the Voltrine frozen into the very ceiling they had built to frighten worlds. A new message came from the even keel then, the same flat voice, Captain Idun Mercer, unhurried. "I told you, begin your descent, and you will not leave the way you arrived. You began your descent." A pause. "You are not destroyed, Provost. Look at your hull readings. Look at your crew. Nothing is burning. Nothing is dying. You are simply held. I want you to sit in that for a while, because I think it is something your empire has never let anyone do to it, and I think it will teach you more than a battle would." Varek's reply was not flat. It was the roar of a man who has built his entire self on never being held. He swore by the ascendancy and the 1,400 folded worlds and the war anthem 9,000 years deep. He promised the human captain the slow folding of Earth, the singing of the human anthem in human schools, the whole machinery of the Voltrine brought down on one small species that had dared. Captain Mercer let him finish. Then she said, "Provost, there are 400 occupation officers aboard your flagship who were taken the way I think your scan conscript at the rail was taken, from a folded world, pressed into your wall because resistance was made to look like madness." The cold thing under Yato's ribs went very still, because she could not know, she could not possibly know, and yet she had said scan conscript, and Yato was the only one at the rail. "Ask them," Mercer said, "whether they would like to keep being part of your mathematics. Then ask yourself how many of your 1,100 ships are crewed by people you stole. And then tell me again how large your numbers are." The channel closed. Yato Ren stood very still at the scan rail, while 491 held warships hung in the sky around him, and he understood that the human ship had not only counted the Voltrine fleet. It had counted the seams in it. It had looked at the wall of the Thousand Hands and seen, where Varek saw 1,100 loyal hulls, 1,100 ships full of folded peoples held together by nothing but the lie that no one could ever stop the Empire. And then it had stopped the Empire, in front of everyone, without killing a soul. The lie did not survive the afternoon. It began on a corvette called the Steady Yield, a small ship crewed mostly by folded resh, held fast at the lower edge of the wall. The conscripts aboard the Steady Yield had watched the Armada try every weapon in the 9,000-year book against a single gray ship and accomplish nothing. They had watched the order to retreat fail. They had heard the human captain say the word stolen on the open command channel, where their Voltrine officers could not pretend it had not been said. And somewhere in the fourth hour, the folded resh aboard the Steady Yield did the thing that a small people learns it can do only when it sees the sky held still by someone on its side. They stopped singing the anthem. It was not a mutiny. No one was hurt. The resh crew simply stood up from their stations, in the middle of the held Armada, and stopped working the guns that could not fire and the engines that could not move. And they waited, because for the first time in the lives of most of them, waiting was not madness. Waiting was the most powerful thing they had ever done. Their Voltrine officers shouted. The shouting did not carry the weight it once had, because a Voltrine officer's authority had always rested on the wall behind him, on the certainty that the Empire was a fact too large to refuse, and the wall was frozen in the sky, and the fact was hanging there going nowhere, held by a tug. Word of the Steady Yield moved through the held Armada faster than any order. Yato watched it spread on his own instruments, station by station going quiet, the folded peoples of 40 worlds setting down their work inside the ships that could not move. He watched Provost General Varek's command channel fill with the panicked voices of officers reporting that their crews had simply stopped, and he watched the Provost General, for the first time in his long career of arriving, have absolutely nothing to arrive at. And through all of it, the even keel hung in the dark, blunt and gray and patient, spending almost no power, holding an empire still so that the empire could finally feel what it had spent 9,000 years doing to everyone else. Captain Idun Mercer had not fired a single shot. She was not finished. But she had not fired a single shot, and Yato Ren, conscript of a folded world, standing at the scan rail of the flagship of the Thousand Hands, began very quietly to understand that he was not watching a battle at all. He was watching a verdict. In the fifth hour, there fell a strange quiet aboard the Crown of Worlds, the kind that comes between the moment a thing becomes certain and the moment anyone is willing to say it aloud. In that hour, Yato Ren did the arithmetic the Voltrine would not. He counted the held ships against the free ones, and he counted the crews, and he counted the worlds each crew had come from, and the count told him a thing the Thousand Hands had never permitted itself to know. The Armada was not 1,100 Voltrine warships. It was perhaps 400 Voltrine warships and 700 ships crewed by the Folded, and the Folded were not loyal. They had never been loyal. They had been afraid, which is a thing that looks like loyalty from above and is nothing like it from inside. The whole monstrous mass of the Thousand Hands, the wall that had made 1,400 worlds put out their own lights, was held together by a single thread, and the thread was fear, and the human ship had just shown every soul in the Armada that the fear had no floor under it. There was nothing beneath the wall. There never had been. It was a ceiling painted on the sky, and a single gray ship had reached up and tapped it, and now everyone could see the paint. Yato thought about his own homeworld, the quiet ledger house, the day the Thousand Hands arrived, and the whole planet put out its lights and opened its gates and called the surrender wisdom. He had believed, for 2 years, that his people had been weak. He understood now that they had been lied to. They had looked up at a painted ceiling and been told it was the weight of the universe, and they had bowed to it, because no one had ever crossed the dark to tap the paint. He did not feel weak anymore. He felt furious, in a clean, cold way that had no panic in it, and the fury was the most alive he had been since the gates of his world swung open. Echo Drain, the old gunmaster, came to find Yato at the rail, which an officer of his rank had no reason to do. He stood beside the conscript and looked out at the held wall of the Armada, the ships of his life's work hanging dead still in the sky, and for a while he said nothing. Then he said, "You knew. In the first hour, I saw your scan. You found the small power number, and you told the provost it was beyond your instruments." He did not say it as an accusation. He said it the way an old man says a thing he has already decided to forgive. Why did you lie, conscript? Yato could have said many things. He chose the true one, because the wall was frozen in the sky, and the lie that resistance was madness was dying all around him, and a person can only carry a true thing under his ribs for so long. Because I am from a world the hands folded, Yato said. Because I learned the anthem, and I learned to feel nothing, and I was good at both, and I hated that I was good at both. And because that ship out there is the first thing I have ever seen that did to the thousand hands what the thousand hands does to everyone. He looked at the old gunmaster without fear, which surprised him. It held you still, it made you wait, and it did not have to kill anyone to do it. I have spent 2 years being told that was impossible. I lied because I wanted the impossible thing to win. Echo Drain was quiet for a long time. He was a man with 40 kill marks on his chest and 9,000 years of war anthem in his bones, and he had just watched all of it fail to scratch a tug. When I was young, Drain said at last, before I rose, I asked my own gunmaster what would happen if the hands ever met an enemy who was not afraid of our numbers. He told me the question was childish. He told me everyone is afraid of our numbers. It is the one thing in the universe that is always true. The old Voltrine looked out at the frozen wall, at the held ships of 40 stolen peoples going quiet one by one. He was wrong, conscript. There was a people who looked at our numbers and did not feel fear. They felt a problem, and they solved it the way you solve a problem, not the way you win a war. He let out a long breath. I think they are going to teach us something. I think we have earned it, and I think I am too old to be ashamed of wanting to learn. Below them, on the surface of Hesh, the people of the begging world had begun, very carefully, to come up out of their cities and look at the sky, where 240 barges hung frozen, and an empire had been parked over their heads by a single gray ship that had crossed the dark because they asked. The even keel held its silence, and held the thousand hands, and waited for the empire to finish understanding what had happened to it. It had not fired a shot. It would not need to. That was the part the Voltrine could not yet bear. Not that they had been beaten. Beaten was a thing they could have understood, eventually, in the language of war. What they could not bear was that they had been set down, gently, like a child who has run too far into the road and been picked up by the collar and held until it stops fighting. The thousand hands had folded 1,400 worlds and broken navies and silenced the songs of 40 peoples, and a tug named after balance had reached out with almost no power at all and decided, simply, that they would be still. There is no kill mark for that. There is no anthem for it. There is only the long quiet of being held, and the slow, terrible clarity that comes to the held, when the engines have stopped screaming, and the guns have stopped firing, and there is nothing left to do but feel, at last, what stillness is. Yato Ren stood at the rail and felt it with them. He had been waiting 2 years to feel it. He found, when it came, that it did not feel like defeat at all. It felt like the moment before something long buried is finally allowed to stand up. Provost General Solvarek did not surrender, because the Voltrine had no right for it, but in the 6th hour he did a thing his empire had even less of a right for. He asked a question. He asked it on a private channel, officer to captain, with the war anthem swallowed down and the grand voice gone, and Yato Ren heard it only because the provost had forgotten the scan rail was still patched into command, and Yato did not announce himself. "What do you want?" Varek said. "You have not killed us. You will not let us land. You will not let us leave. A ship that wanted conquest would have taken the planet. A ship that wanted slaughter would have begun it. You want neither. So tell me, human, what is the price of being let go?" Captain Idun Mercer answered without hurry, the way she answered everything, and for the first time there was something underneath the flatness that was not cold. It was tired. It was the tiredness of a person who has had to explain a simple thing too many times to people who would not hear it. "I do not want a price, Provost. I want a number." A pause. "You have spent this whole campaign certain that you understand mass. You count hulls. You count guns. You count worlds. You are very good at counting the things you bring. I am going to make you count, just once, the things you have taken, and then I am going to let you go." The dark throat of the even keel did not open wider. The held armada did not lurch. But across every screen in the thousand hands, on the gun decks and the bridges and the occupation barges frozen in the high cold air, a list began to scroll. It was not a threat, it was not propaganda, it was a list of worlds, and beside each world a number, and the number was not the tonnage the Voltrine had gained. It was the count of the folded, the people taken, the conscripts pressed, the names of the small peoples the thousand hands had arrived upon and swallowed without a shot, world after world after world, 1,406 of them, scrolling slow enough to read. Yato Ren watched his own world go past. He watched the count beside it. He watched the name of the ledger house he had been taken from, because the humans had it. The humans had all of it, and he understood that the even keel had not crossed the dark with only a field engine in its hull. It had crossed the dark carrying the record the Voltrine had never once allowed anyone to keep. That was the second weapon, and Yato understood now that it had always been the more important one. The field that held the armada still was only the door. The list was what walked through it. The thousand hands had spent 9,000 years making certain that no count was ever kept, that the folded peoples were folded one at a time, each in its own silence, none of them ever shown the others, so that no one could ever feel the true size of what had been done. A people that loses one world believes it has suffered a tragedy. A people that sees 1,406 worlds lost in a single scrolling list, beside its own, understands that it has suffered a crime, and a crime has perpetrators, and perpetrators can be refused. The Voltrine had survived by keeping the folded apart. The humans had simply put them all on one screen at once, and held the sky still so they would have time to read. Yato thought about how long it must have taken Earth to gather the list. The humans had never set foot on most of these worlds. They had reconstructed the crime from the outside, from the wreckage and the silence and the patterns of the foldings, piece by patient piece, the count of 1,406 stolen peoples assembled by a species that had not lost a single one of them, simply because it believed the count should exist. Yato had spent 2 years being told the Voltrine kept no records, because records were beneath an empire that never looked back. He understood now that they kept no records, because the records were the one thing that could end them. "This is what you are made of," Mercer said, while the list scrolled. Not 1,100 ships, a wall of stolen peoples held together by the belief that no one could ever stop you. I stopped you. I did it with one ship and almost no power, in an afternoon, and I did not kill a single one of you to do it. I want every folded soul in your armada to see that. I want them to see the wall held still while the truth scrolls past. Because once a folded people has seen that, Provost, you do not get to be a fact anymore. You go back to being a choice, and choices can be refused. Varek said, with the last of his grandeur, "You think a list will unmake 9,000 years." "No," Mercer said, "I think your own people will. I am only holding the door so they have time to read it." That was the hour the thousand hands came apart, and it came apart the way the humans had built it to, which was quietly, and from the inside, and without a single death. It started, as Yato had known it would, among the folded. The Resh of the Steady Yield had already set down their work. Now the list gave them the rest of it, the count of their own taken kin, scrolling past in the clear, where their Voltrine officers could not call it a lie. Ship after ship in the held wall went the same way. Not violence, refusal. The folded peoples of 40 worlds, crewing the engines and the guns of an empire that could not move, stood up at their stations and stopped. They did not need weapons. The even keel had already taken the only thing that mattered, which was the empire's ability to make them afraid. And then, in the deepest hour of the held armada, the thing happened that no one aboard the Crown of Worlds was ready for. It was not the folded who broke the Voltrine. It was the Voltrine. Echo Drain, the old gunmaster, walked off his gun deck. He did it slowly, with 40 kill marks heavy on his chest, and he came to the bridge of the Crown of Worlds, where Provost General Varek stood watching his empire be parked, and the old gunmaster said, in front of every officer. "Provost, I have fired every weapon we have into that ship. There is no scratch. There is no death. There is only the list, and the list is true, and our crews have read it, and they have set down their guns, and they are right to," he breathed. "I have served the hands for 40 foldings. I served because I believed our numbers were a kind of mercy, that arriving in such mass that no one dared fight us meant no one had to die. I told myself we were the gentle conquerors. I told myself the anthem was a small price." His old voice did not break, but something behind it did. "That ship out there held us still without killing one of us, and it has just shown me what gentle conquest actually was. It was theft with the screaming taken out so the thief could sleep. I am done, Provost. Hold me for treason if you can find a cell that still answers your helm." There was no cell that answered the helm. There was nothing aboard the 1,000 Hands that answered the helm. The Empire was held in the sky over a begging world, and its oldest gunmaster had just told the truth on the bridge, and one by one the officers of the Crown of Worlds looked at the frozen wall and the scrolling list and the single gray ship that had cost almost nothing to do all of it, and they understood that the war was already over and had been over since the first hour, and the only question left was what kind of people they would be when they were finally let go. Yato watched the truth move through the officers the way he had watched it move through the folded crews, and he was surprised to find that it looked the same. He had thought, for 2 years, that the conquerors and the conquered were two different kinds of being, one strong and one weak, one that did the folding and one that was folded. He saw now that they were the same kind, that the officers of the Crown of Worlds had been folded too, in their own way, folded into the belief that largeness was the only worth, and arriving was the only verb, and that to question the wall was to fall off the edge of the only world that mattered. The even keel had held them all still, the conquerors and the conquered alike, and shown them all the same list, and given them all the same choice, and the choice did not care which side of the wall a soul had stood on. It only asked whether the soul could bear to keep being part of a thing it had finally been forced to see clearly. Most of them could not. That, Yato understood, was the most human thing about the whole human plan. It had not assumed the Voltrine were monsters. It had assumed they were people who had never once been made to look, and it had simply made them look. Yato Ren stepped away from the scan rail. He did it without deciding to, the way a held breath finally leaves the body. He walked across the bridge of the flagship of the 1,000 Hands, a 19-season conscript from a folded ledger house, and he stood beside the old gunmaster, in front of the Provost General, and he said the thing he had kept under his ribs for 2 years. "You took me from a quiet world that never raised a weapon at you," Yato said. "You did not burn it. You just arrived, so many of you, that fighting looked like madness. And you taught me that resistance was the foolish choice, and survival was the wise one. And I believed you, because everyone believed you, because the wall was always there behind every word you said." He was not shouting. He found he did not need to. "The wall is frozen in the sky, Provost. It cost a tug almost nothing to freeze it, and I am standing here telling you that resistance was never madness. It was only impossible. And now it is not, because someone crossed the dark and made it possible, and did not kill anyone doing it, which means you never had to be killed either, which means every soul you ever told that fighting meant dying was told a lie to keep them folded." He looked at the Provost without the old fear, and the absence of the fear was the most powerful thing he had ever felt. "I am from a small people. We have been waiting 9,000 years for someone to count the other side. They finally did. I am done singing your anthem." Provost General Sul Varric, who had folded 40 worlds and never once been refused, looked at the conscript and the old gunmaster and the bridge full of officers who would not meet his eye, and at the frozen wall of his empire hanging in the sky over Hesh, held still by a ship named after Balance. And he did not roar. He sat down in the great chair of the Crown of Worlds, the chair built so that a provost could watch worlds fall from a comfortable height, and he was quiet for a long time. When he spoke at last, the grand voice was entirely gone, and what was left was only an old conqueror who had finally been held still long enough to feel the weight of what he had spent his life arriving upon. 40 worlds, he said. I never saw one of them fight. I told myself that meant they had chosen us, that the wall was a mercy, that arriving in such numbers spared everyone the war. He looked at the scrolling list, at the 1,406 names and their 1,406 counts. It was not mercy, it was a hand over the mouth. I held the mouth shut so I would not have to hear the scream, and I called the silence consent. He closed his eyes. She is right. We were never strong, we were only large, and the first thing in 9,000 years to weigh more than us did not even have to fire. He opened the command channel himself, with his own hand, and he spoke to the even keel, and to the held armada, and to the begging world below, all at once. This is Sol Varek, Provost General of the Thousand Hands. The landing is ended. The folding of Hesh is ended. To every folded soul in this armada, you are held by no wall of mine. The wall is frozen in the sky. Read the list. Choose. It was not a surrender. The Voltrine still had no right for that. But it was the first true thing a provost of the Thousand Hands had said into the open in 9,000 years, and the held peoples of 40 worlds heard it. And across the frozen armada something began that the Empire had spent its whole history making sure could never start. The folded began to choose. It spread the way a thaw spreads, which is to say from the edges and from below, in the places no one is watching, until the whole frozen surface gives at once. The corvette's steady yield had been the first crack. The flagship's own bridge had been the deepest. In between, across 1,100 held hulls, the same small scene played out hundreds of times, with hundreds of faces, in hundreds of folded tongues. A crew read the list. A crew found its own world on the list. A crew looked at the frozen wall and the gray ship that had stopped the Empire without killing anyone, and a crew set down its work. There was no signal, no leader, no plan. There did not need to be. The humans had not organized a rebellion. They had removed the only thing that had ever prevented one, which was the belief that it could not be done, and the rebellion organized itself, the way water finds its way downhill the moment the dam is gone. Yato watched it on his instruments, station by station going dark across the armada, and he thought it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and the quietest. There was no roar of victory. There was only the slow falling silence of an empire's machinery as the people who ran it stopped, one crew at a time, in a sky held still by a single gray ship that asked nothing of them but that they read what had been taken and choose. Captain Idun Mercer's voice came once more, quiet, and the tiredness in it had eased a little, the way a person's voice eases when a long task is finally turning toward done. "Thank you, Provost," she said. "That was the only thing I came for. Not your ships, not your world. That sentence. Read the list, choose. You said it yourself. Into the clear, where 40 peoples could hear. I could have made you say it at gunpoint 1,000 times, and it would have meant nothing. You said it held still, with your guns intact and your crew alive, and that is the only way it could ever be true." A pause. "I am going to start letting you go now. Slowly. The held ships first, the empty ones, then the crewed. I want you to feel the difference between being released and escaping, because your whole empire was built on never letting anyone feel it." The dark throat of the even keel began, at last, to ease open its grip. Yato Ren watched the first held warship come free, far out at the edge of the wall, an empty corvette that drifted gently as the human field set it down in the dark, like a cup returned to a shelf. He watched a second, a third. The even keel released the Thousand Hands the way it had held them, without violence, without triumph, one hull at a time, and Yato understood that even this was a lesson, that the humans were showing 40 stolen peoples what it looked like to be handled by someone who did not want to own them. He had come up to the scan rail that morning, a conscript of an empire that had never lost a world. He stood now on the bridge of its flagship, beside an old gunmaster who had set down his kill marks, while a single gray ship undid 9,000 years of arriving, gently, in front of everyone, and let an empire feel for the first time what it was to be held and then released by a hand that meant it no harm. The Voltrine had conquered 1,406 worlds. One human warship had left them helpless, and had done it so carefully that not one of them had to die to learn the lesson. And that, Yato understood at last, was the whole of the human point. They had not come to win. Winning was a Voltrine idea, and the Voltrine were very good at it, and look where it had left them. The humans had come to make the Empire stop, and it had stopped. The releasing took 3 days, and the Voltrine learned more in those 3 days than they had in 9,000 years of arriving. Captain Idun Mercer let the empty ships go first, and then she stopped, and she would not free a single crewed hull until the crew aboard it had been given the list and the choice. This was not cruelty. It was the opposite of cruelty, performed slowly enough that even the 1,000 hands could not mistake it for anything else. The even keel held the crewed warships fast in the sky, while their folded peoples read, one ship at a time, the count of their own taken kin, and decided, freely, whether they wished to remain Voltrine. Most did not. It did not happen in a single great wave. It happened the way truth happens to people who have been held under a hand for generations, which is unevenly, and with terror, and then all at once. Aboard the corvette steady yield the Resh had already chosen. Aboard 100 other ships the folded chose in the first day, the moment the human field eased, and they understood that to refuse the Empire would not, this time, mean dying in the dark. Aboard others it took longer. There were folded peoples in the 1,000 hands who had been folded so long they no longer remembered another song, and for them the choice was not joy, it was grief. They had to mourn the people they had been before they could become anyone else. The even keel waited for all of it. The single gray ship hung in the sky over Hesh for 3 days, holding an empire still, costing almost nothing, while 40 stolen peoples did the slow work of remembering they had a choice. Yato thought, watching the slowness, that the slowness was itself a kind of mercy he had no name for. The 1,000 hands had done everything fast, worlds folded in a single afternoon, peoples pressed in an hour, anthems taught before the next sunrise, because speed was how you took something before its owner had time to decide it mattered. The humans did the opposite of fast. They held the sky still and refused to hurry, and they let the folded peoples take all the time they needed, even the time to be afraid, even the time to grieve, even the time to choose wrong and then change their minds. There was a corvette of folded Anu who chose, on the first day, to remain Voltrine, out of a fear so old it had become a kind of home, and the even keel did not free their ship, and did not crush it, and did not argue. It simply held them, gently, and left the list scrolling, and waited. On the second day, the Anu changed their minds. The humans had known they would. They had only needed to be given the one thing the 1,000 hands had never given anyone, which was time. Yato understood, by the end of the second day, that this was the difference between the two empires laid bare. The Voltrine took, the humans waited. And the waiting was stronger, because a thing that is taken can be taken back, but a thing that is chosen, slowly, in the clear, with the door held open and no hand on the back of the neck, belongs to the one who chose it forever. Yato Ren spent those 3 days doing a thing he had not expected. He helped. He knew the seams of the 1,000 hands better than any human could. He had stood at the scan rail and watched the folded crews of 40 worlds, and he knew which ships held peoples too long folded to choose easily, and which officers would try to keep their crews afraid even now, and where the old machinery of the Anthem still ran in the deep decks. He brought all of it to the bridge, to the old gunmaster Echo Drain and, through a patched channel, to Captain Mercer herself, and together they went ship by ship through the held armada, not freeing the folded by force but reaching them, making sure the list got past the officers who would have hidden it, making sure no crew chose to stay only because no one had told them they could leave. Yato saw the human captain only once in those 3 days, and never her face. The even keel never opened to the armada it held. It sent no boarding parties, demanded no surrender ceremony, planted no flag aboard the crown of worlds. It simply hung in the sky, blunt and gray and patient, and did its work through the voice on the channel, and the field from its throat, and the list scrolling on every screen. Yato found that this too was deliberate, and that it was the deepest difference of all between the humans and the Thousand Hands. The Voltrine had always needed to be seen conquering. The wall was a performance. The anthem was a performance. The whole machinery of arriving was built to be watched, so that the watching peoples would learn to be afraid. The humans did not perform. They did the work and let the work be the whole of the message, and there was something in that plainness that reached the folded more deeply than any display could have. A people that has been conquered by spectacle is freed, it turns out, by the absence of one. The even keel never once asked to be admired. It only asked the armada to be still, and the worlds to be free, and then it went back to being a small gray ship doing a quiet job, and the folded peoples, watching, understood that they had finally met a strength that did not need an audience. On the second day, Mercer spoke to Yato directly for the first time. He had wondered if she would. She did not waste it on praise. "You knew the small power number in the first hour," she said. "Drain told me. You lied to your provost to give us time." A pause. "Why are you helping us now, Yato Ren? You could have walked off this flagship the moment the wall froze. You earned that. Why stay in the work?" Yato thought about it. He found the answer had been under his ribs the whole time, waiting, the way the cold thing had waited. "Because no one came for my world," he said. "The hands arrived, and we were small, and the wall was behind every word, and no one crossed the dark to hold the sky still over us. I learned the anthem, and I learned to feel nothing, and I told myself that was the only ending a small people gets." He looked out at the held armada, at the ships full of folded peoples choosing themselves back. "You came for Hesh. You can only be in one sky at a time, Captain. There are 1,406 worlds on your list, and you are one ship. But I am not one ship. I am one of the folded, and I know the seams, and if I help you finish here, then the next world the hands ever try to arrive upon will already know what I know now," he breathed. "That resistance was never madness. It was only impossible, and you made it possible, and now it is my work to make sure no folded people ever believes the lie again. You held the sky. I will hold the truth. That is why I stay." There was a silence on the channel. When Mercer spoke again, the tiredness had gone all the way out of her voice, and what was left was something Yato had not heard from any human yet. It was respect. "That," she said, "is the whole reason Earth built this ship instead of a bigger gun. We did not come to free 1,400 worlds. Yato, one ship cannot. We came to free one, in front of all the others, so completely and so gently that the folded would do the rest themselves." A pause. "You are the rest. You always were. We just held the sky still long enough for you to see it." By the third day, the shape of the new thing was clear, and it was not an empire, and it was not a war. Of the 1,100 ships of the Thousand Hands, more than 700 chose to leave the Voltrine entirely. Their folded crews took the hulls they had been pressed to serve and turned them toward home, toward the 40 stolen worlds, carrying the list and the truth and the memory of the day. A single gray ship had held an empire still. They did not go as a fleet. They went as 40 peoples going home, scattering into the dark, each ship a piece of the wall the Voltrine had built, coming apart and walking away on its own legs. It was a strange thing to watch an empire come apart and never see a body. Yato had imagined, in the 2 years he carried the cold thing under his ribs, that the fall of the Thousand Hands would look like every other war he had been forced to study, fire and wreckage and the long lists of the dead. It looked like none of that. It looked like a great frozen wall in the sky, slowly losing its pieces, ship after ship turning and going home. The brown rain of barges set down gently on the surface of Hesh, where the troops aboard them walked out into a free world, and finding nothing to occupy, sat down in the unfamiliar sun and did not know what to do with their hands. There was no slaughter to avenge. That was the thing the Voltrine could not climb past. An empire that has been slaughtered can dream of slaughtering back. An empire that has been held still and spared and gently disassembled has nowhere to put its grief except onto itself. where it belongs. The Voltrine themselves, the true Voltrine, the conquerors who had run the Thousand Hands, were left with fewer than 400 ships, and no folded peoples to crew them, and an old provost general, sitting in the great chair of the crown of worlds, with 9,000 years of arriving, turned to ash in his hands. Captain Mercer did not destroy them. She could have. Everyone aboard the Crown of Worlds understood, by the third day, that the even keel could have closed its dark throat at any moment and crushed the held armada like a fist closing on glass, and that it had chosen, every hour, not to. The understanding did something to the Voltrine that no defeat could have done. A people who is beaten can hate the one who beat it. A people who is held, and spared, and released, and shown the truth, and spared again, has nothing to hate. It has only itself to look at. On the third day, Mercer freed the Crown of Worlds last, and before she let it go, she spoke to Provost General Varric one final time, on the open channel, where what remained of the Voltrine and what remained of the Folded could all hear. I am letting you go now, Provost, all of you, not because you have earned it, because killing you would teach the galaxy that the only answer to the Thousand Hands was a bigger fist, and that is the one lesson I came all this way to unteach. The dark throat of the even keel eased its last grip, and the great flagship of the Voltrine drifted free, ponderous and quiet, in the sky over a world it had not been allowed to fold. You will keep your 400 ships. You will keep your lives. You will go home to a Voltrine that has lost 40 stolen peoples and learned that its numbers were never strength. And you will live the rest of your days knowing that one ship did this, without firing, and that the reason it did not have to fire is that it was never your match in violence. It was your master in restraint. That is the thing you could never build, Provost, because you spent 9,000 years arriving, and you never once learned how to hold still. Varric, in the great chair, was quiet for a long moment. Then the old conqueror said the last grand thing he would ever say, except it was not grand at all, it was the smallest and truest sentence of his life. What do we tell them, he said. The Voltrine, the young ones who will ask what happened to the Thousand Hands. What do we tell them we met out here? Captain Idun Mercer answered him gently, the way you answer someone who has finally, far too late, asked the right question. Tell them you met a people who counted what you took, she said, and tell them that when the count was read aloud, in the clear, with your guns intact and your crew alive, even your own oldest gunmaster could not bear the sound of it. Tell them the wall came down from the inside, Provost, because that is the only place a wall like yours ever comes down. And tell them the ship that did it never fired, so that no Voltrine child ever grows up believing the only thing worth being is large. A pause, and then the very last of it. And tell them its name, so that the next time the Thousand Hands feel the urge to arrive somewhere uninvited, they remember that somewhere in the dark there is a small gray ship named Even Keel that does not push and does not chase and cannot be moved and will simply decide that you are going to be still. The channel closed. The Crown of Worlds turned, slow and heavy, and began the long voyage home to a Voltrine that would never again be a fact, only a choice, and a much smaller one than it had been 3 days before. Yato Ren did not go with it. He stood on the bridge of the flagship until the last moment, until the human field was fully gone and the great ship was free to move, and then he gathered the few things a conscript owns, and he went down through the decks of the Crown of Worlds to the small bay where the Folded had begun to gather, the ones from the flagship itself, who had chosen, like the others, not to remain Voltrine. There were more of them than he had expected. The seams in the wall had run deeper than even Yato knew. Old Echo Drain found him there, in the bay, among the Folded. The gunmaster was not Folded. He was true Voltrine, 40 kill marks and 9,000 years of anthem in his bones, and he had every right to take his place on the Crown of Worlds and ride home with the conquerors he had served all his life. He did not have to come down to the bay, he came anyway. I am too old to start again, Drain said, and too old not to. The Provost will keep his 400 ships and his lost worlds and his great chair, and he will spend the rest of his days telling young Voltrine that being large was never strength, which is a good thing for a defeated man to teach, and a useless thing for me. The old gunmaster looked at the gathered folded, at Yato. But you are going out to the 1406. You are going to hold the truth over worlds that have not heard it yet. So the next time the hands arrive, the folding does not take. He set his hand against his chest, against the heavy kill marks, and for the first time Yato saw the old Voltrine look not ashamed of them, but ready to spend the rest of his life answering for them. I know how the hands fold a world, conscript. I helped fold 40 of them. If you are going to teach worlds how not to be folded, you will want someone who knows exactly how it is done. Yato Ren, 19 seasons old, of a quiet ledger house, on a world that had asked no one for help and received no one, looked at the old gunmaster, who had folded 40 worlds and now wished to spend his last years unfolding them. The wall comes down from the inside, Yato said. The captain told the provost that. It is the only place it ever comes down. He almost smiled. I think you have just been the inside, gunmaster. I think you should come. They left the Crown of Worlds together, the conscript and the old conqueror, in a small folded crude ship that turned, like all the others, away from the dying empire and out toward the 1406. Above them, in the sky over Hesh, the single gray warship named after Balance hung quiet and blunt and patient, having held an empire still, and spared it, and released it, and changed it, without firing one shot. It was already turning toward the next world that had asked. The story of the day the 1,000 hands were held should have ended over Hesh, but a held empire is a slow thing to fall, and the truth Yato Ren carried out into the dark moved slower still, and that is why the most important part came 2 years later, and far away, and was very nearly missed. In those 2 years, Yato Ren and Echo Drain went to 41 worlds. They did not go as conquerors, which would have been the only way the Voltrine knew how to arrive. They went the other way. They came to the edge of a system that the 1,000 hands had folded long ago, a system where some folded people still crewed an old Voltrine garrison out of a habit too deep to name, and they did not threaten, and they did not promise. They simply read the list, the count of the taken, the names of the folded, and on every one of the 41 worlds, the same thing happened that had happened over Hesh, the slow, uneven terror, and then the all at once, the folded standing up from the work, because someone had finally told them, in the clear, that the wall behind every Voltrine word had always been a held breath, and a held breath cannot last forever. The reading was never the same twice, because no two folded peoples had been folded the same way. On the 9th world there were folded Surret, who had been pressed so long that their children had never known another life, and for them the list was not a key but a wound, and Yato learned to read it differently, slowly, with the old gunmaster beside him to answer the questions only a Voltrine could answer, the questions about how the folding had been done, and why it had worked, and whether it had been, in the deepest part of it, their own fault for not fighting. It had not been their fault. That was the thing Yato had crossed the dark to tell them, the thing the even keel had told him without words, on the day the rain stopped falling in the sky over Hesh. Resistance had never been madness. It had only been impossible, and a thing that was impossible until someone made it possible was no one's fault for not having done. On the 17th world, there was a garrison of true Voltrine who had not heard, who still believed in the wall, who arrived in the old way and found, waiting for them, not a human warship, but a people who had already been freed and already knew, and who simply declined to be afraid. The garrison brought more, the only verb it knew. The freed brought the list, and read it in the clear, and the garrison's own folded crews set down their work, the way the steady yield had set down its work 2 years before, because the truth, once it is loose, does not stop being true just because a new wall arrives to deny it. The 17th world freed itself before Yato's ship even reached it. He found, when he arrived, that there was nothing left for him to do but stand in the sun with the people who had done it, and that was the best day of his life. The Voltrine did not send the 1,000 hands after them. The 1,000 hands no longer existed in the way it once had. Provost General Varek had gone home and done the thing Captain Mercer told him to do, which was tell the young Voltrine the truth, and the truth, once a conqueror begins to tell it, does not stop where the conqueror would like. The empire that had folded 1,406 worlds was coming apart from the inside, ship by ship and world by world, not in war, but in choice, exactly as a single gray warship had arranged over a single begging planet, knowing it could only be in one sky at a time, and trusting the folded to be the rest. Yato was the rest, and the old gunmaster beside him, who knew exactly how a world was folded and spent his last years teaching worlds how not to be, was the rest. And on each of the 41 worlds they left behind them more of the rest, more folded peoples who now knew, and who would carry the knowing to the next system, and the next, the way the truth had carried from the steady yield through the whole held armada in a single afternoon. It was on the 41st world that Yato saw the even keel again. He had not expected to. The single gray warship was, by then, a story more than a ship, a thing the freed peoples told their children, and Yato had half come to believe it had sailed off the edge of the real and into the place where the things that save you live after they are done. But the 41st world had asked for help, the way Hesh had asked, against a Voltrine remnant fleet that still believed in arriving, a stubborn knot of true conquerors who had not yet heard that the wall had come down, and the ship that came to the edge of the system, blunt and gray and patient, costing almost nothing, was the even keel. Yato watched it from the bridge of his own folded crude ship, as it held the remnant fleet still in the sky, the same way, gently, one hull at a time, the dark throat opening, and the falling stopping, and the engines screaming against a stillness that did not care. He watched the remnant conquerors learn, in an afternoon, the thing the 1,000 hands had learned over Hesh, and when it was done, when the held were spared, and the truth was read, and the folded among the remnant began to choose, the human captain's voice came across the dark, the same flat, unhurried voice, 2 years older and not 1 degree less patient. "Yato Ren," said Captain Idun Mercer, "I wondered if I would find you out here." "You are still one ship," Yato said. 41 worlds, and you are still one ship. "And you are still the rest," she said. He could hear, even across the dark, that something in her was glad. "I am told there are 600 ships of the old 1,000 hands, now crewed by their freed peoples, carrying the list from system to system, undoing the foldings faster than I could reach 1 in 10 of them. I am told an old Voltrine gunmaster, with 40 kill marks, has taught 9 worlds how the hands fold a planet, so that the folding does not take. I am told a conscript from a quiet ledger house has become a thing the remnant Voltrine are afraid of, which is a person who arrives somewhere and does not threaten and simply reads what was taken until the wall comes down from the inside. A pause. I held one sky, Yato. You held the truth. I think between us, we may actually finish this. Yato Ren looked out at the held remnant fleet, at the freed peoples already standing up from their work, at the single gray warship that had crossed the dark for the 41st time to hold a sky still over people who had asked. "Why?" he said. He had wanted to ask it for 2 years. Why this way? You could have built a bigger gun. Earth could have built a fleet that outmassed the 1,000 hands and crushed them in a season, and no one would have called it wrong. The Voltrine folded 1,400 worlds. They earned a bigger gun. Why a tug? Why hold us still, and spare us, and read us a list, and trust the folded to do the rest? Why the slow way, Captain, when you had the strength for the fast one? Captain Mercer was quiet for a moment, and when she answered, it was the longest she had ever spoken to him, and it was the answer he carried for the rest of his life. "Because a bigger gun teaches the wrong thing," she said. "If Earth had crushed the 1,000 hands, every people in this arm of the galaxy would have learned that the only answer to a conqueror is a larger conqueror. The Voltrine would have died believing they lost because they were not big enough, and somewhere a young Voltrine would have started building toward bigger, and in 9,000 more years it would all happen again. A new wall, a new sky with a ceiling on it, new folded peoples taught that resistance is madness." A pause. We did not want to win the war, Yato. Winning was the Voltrine idea. We wanted to end the reason for it. And you cannot end the reason for a thing by being better at the thing. You end it by showing, in front of everyone, that there was always another way, and that the other way was stronger. Her voice did not rise. It never rose. A tug is not weaker than a gun, Yato. It is the thing a gun can never be. It can hold something still without destroying it. It can stop you without ending you. We built a ship that could stop the largest armada in the galaxy and could not, by its nature, kill it, so that the one thing the folded peoples would learn from us was the one thing the Voltrine could never teach. That you can be held without being broken. That you can be stopped without being killed. That there is a strength that does not need anyone to die. She let it sit. We did not come to beat the 1,000 hands, Yato. We came to outlast the idea of them. And the only way to outlast an idea is to put a better one in front of every soul who was ever folded by the old one, and then trust them to choose it, which they did, which you did, every single time. Yato Ren did not speak for a long while. He had been 19 seasons old at the scan rail of the Crown of Worlds, a conscript of an empire that had never lost a world, and he had watched a single gray ship reach out with almost no power at all and decide that the 1,000 hands would be still. He had thought, at the time, that he was watching a weapon. He understood now that he had been watching an argument. The whole of it, the holding and the sparing and the list and the slow, careful releasing, had been one long sentence spoken to 40 stolen peoples and one defeated empire, and the sentence was this: there is another way, and it is not weaker, and you are allowed to choose it. He had chosen it. 41 worlds had chosen it. And the choosing was still spreading, out past the edge of where Yato could see, ship by ship and world by world, the wall of the 1,000 hands coming down from the inside the way Captain Mercer had always known it would. Because the only place a wall like that ever comes down is the inside, and the humans had simply held the sky still long enough for the inside to remember it was there. I have a question of my own, Mercer said, after the silence had run its course. 2 years ago, on the flagship, you told the old gunmaster you lied to your provost because you wanted the impossible thing to win. Do you still think it was impossible? What we did? Yato Ren looked at the held remnant fleet, and the freed peoples, and the 41 worlds behind him, and the 1,406 ahead, and the single gray warship that was, even now, beginning to ease open its grip, and let the spared go gently into the dark. No, he said. I think it was the most possible thing I have ever seen. I think it was always possible. I think the Voltrine spent 9,000 years making sure no one could see it, and you crossed the dark and made everyone see it in an afternoon, and now it cannot be unseen, he breathed. That is the thing about the truth, Captain. It is not fragile. You only have to hold the sky still long enough for one folded people to read it in the clear, and then it holds itself. You taught me that. I have been teaching it ever since. Good, said Captain Idun Mercer, and there was the whole of 2 years in the word. Then I think you do not need one ship anymore, Yato Ren. I think you are the ship now. All of you. 40 stolen peoples and 600 freed hulls, and one old gunmaster who knows how the folding is done. A pause, and then the last thing the human captain ever said to him, the thing he would tell his own children, and they would tell theirs, on a world that had once been folded and was now only itself. I held one sky. You are going to hold the rest. Go and hold it. I will be out here if a world asks, but I think, soon, the worlds are going to stop needing to ask. I think you have nearly made it so they can hold their own. The even keel turned its blunt gray nose toward the dark, and it went, the way it had come, without triumph, without a banner, costing almost nothing, a single warship that had held the largest armada in the galaxy still, and spared every soul aboard it, and changed everything, and never once fired a shot. Yato Ren watched it go until it was only a point, and then not even that. Then he turned his own ship toward the next world. He was 21 seasons old now, no longer a conscript of anything. Behind him, the freed peoples of the 41st world were already standing up from the work the remnant Voltrine had pressed them to, already reading the list, already learning the thing that could not be unlearned, that resistance had never been madness, that it had only been impossible, and that the impossible had been done, in front of everyone, gently, by a tug. The old gunmaster Echo Drain came up onto the bridge beside him, 40 kill marks heavy on his chest, and his last years spent answering for every one of them. And he looked at the dark where the even keel had gone, and he said, "She called you the ship now." "She did," Yato said. "She is right," Drain said. "There is no held sky here anymore, no human field. The remnant fleet is freed, and the wall is down, and not one of us fired. We did this. The Folded did this. The way she showed us." The old conqueror was quiet for a moment, and then he said the thing that Yato understood to be the whole of what the human warship had crossed the dark to teach. The Thousand Hands believed that the strongest thing in the universe was to arrive somewhere uninvited, with so much mass that no one dared refuse you. And the strongest thing in the universe turned out to be a single gray ship that could not be moved, holding the sky still, so that the people underneath it could finally stand up. He set his hand against the heavy kill marks. "I helped fold 40 worlds, conscript. I will spend whatever is left of me helping unfold them. And when I am gone, the worlds will keep unfolding, because that is the thing she built, not a weapon, a truth that holds itself once it is read. We are the proof of it. We are the ship now." There was a thing Yato came to understand only at the very end, on the bridge of his freed ship with the old gunmaster beside him. And it was the thing he wished he could go back and tell the boy at the scan rail who had counted a single gray ship 3 times, because his training said a number repeated 3 times could not be a mistake. The Voltrine had been afraid of exactly the wrong thing for 9,000 years. They had built their whole empire to make sure no one could ever bring more force against them than they could bring back, and they had succeeded, and it had not saved them, because force had never been the thing that could end them. The thing that could end them was a list, and a held sky, and 3 days of patience, none of which their numbers could touch. They had armored themselves against the one attack that would never come, and left themselves naked to the one that did. And the humans had seen it, somehow from across the whole dark, that the largest armada in the galaxy could be left completely helpless, not by a larger armada, but by a single ship that refused to play the game the armada had spent 9,000 years learning to win. That was the part Yato told the freed peoples, on world after world, when they asked how it had been done. Not the field, not the dark throat. Those were only tools. The real weapon, he told them, was that the humans had understood the Thousand Hands better than the Thousand Hands understood themselves. They had looked at an empire that worshipped largeness and seen, underneath it, a small frightened thing that had never once been told no. And they had crossed the dark to tell it no, gently, completely, in front of everyone it had ever folded, and the no had been enough, because it was the one thing 9,000 years of arriving had never built a defense against. Yato Ren put his hand on the helm of a ship crewed by the freed, and he turned it toward a world that had not yet heard, carrying the list and the truth, and the memory of the day. A single gray warship named after balance had looked at an empire of 1,406 conquered worlds and decided, without anger and without firing, that it would simply be still. The Voltrine had conquered worlds. One human warship had left them helpless, and had done it so gently, and so completely, and so entirely without killing, that the helplessness had not stayed with the Voltrine at all. It had become the freedom of everyone they had ever folded. The wall came down from the inside. The folded stood up. The truth held itself, once it was read in the clear. And somewhere out in the dark, a small gray ship that could not be moved was turning, patient and blunt and quiet, toward the next sky that needed holding still. It would not have to hold many more. The folded had learned to hold their own.